It's the final week of July 2026, and there's a number that's been sitting quietly at the center of this entire war for more than a year now, a number that almost never makes the front page, even though it might matter more than any single airstrike that has happened throughout this entire conflict. 440.9 kilograms. That's how much 60% enriched uranium the International Atomic Energy Agency believes Iran still possesses. Material that's sitting somewhere under rubble, under mountains, inside tunnels that survived the most powerful bunker-busting campaign in American history. For more than a year, Iran's entire strategy around this material has been built on one simple bet, that if you bury something deep enough and never confirm exactly where it is, nobody can actually come and take it away from you. That bet is now being tested in a completely different way than anyone expected. Because the conversation in Washington has quietly shifted from destroying that uranium to physically going in and getting it. Let's walk through how that shift happened, why it matters so much more than another round of airstrikes, and why Iran's decades-old strategy of hiding in plain sight might finally be running out of road. To understand why this material matters so much right now in this specific moment of the war, you have to go back to what actually happened in June of 2025, because that's the moment this entire story really begins. The United States and Israel launched a massive coordinated strike against 3 of Iran's most important nuclear facilities, Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan, using everything from massive bunker-busting bombs to precision cruise missiles in an operation specifically designed to cripple Iran's ability to build a nuclear weapon. At the time, officials described it as a decisive success, and in terms of physical infrastructure damage, it genuinely was. But here's the problem that emerged almost immediately afterward, and it's a problem that's still unresolved to this day. Verifying whether a bomb actually destroyed enriched uranium is nowhere near as simple as verifying whether it destroyed a building. Satellite images can show you a collapsed structure, a crater, a damaged roof, but uranium itself can't be seen through a normal camera lens, and there's no single piece of technology capable of remotely confirming from the outside whether a stockpile of nuclear material actually got vaporized in a strike or whether it survived intact somewhere underneath the wreckage. That uncertainty became the central mystery of this entire war almost overnight. Before those June strikes, Iran had built up a stockpile of roughly 22,000 pounds, about 11 tons, of enriched uranium at various levels, developed steadily over the years since the original 2015 nuclear agreement collapsed. Of that broader stockpile, the material everyone worries about most is the portion enriched to 60% purity, because 60% represents the vast majority of the technical work required to reach actual weapons-grade material at 90%. Analysts have been consistently blunt about this point. Moving uranium from natural levels up to 20% enrichment is extraordinarily difficult and time-consuming. But moving from 20% to 60% is considerably easier, and pushing from 60% up to 90% weapons-grade material is easier still. In other words, Iran had already done almost all of the hard technical work. The remaining step, according to multiple nuclear security experts, would be relatively fast and relatively straightforward if Iran's centrifuges were still operational and the material was actually accessible. So when those June 2025 strikes hit, the world was watching closely for confirmation that this specific, most dangerous portion of Iran's stockpile had actually been destroyed. That confirmation never really came. Just weeks after the strikes, Israeli officials privately told their American counterparts that the enriched uranium buried deep within the Isfahan facility might still be accessible, that Iranian engineers could potentially recover it, though doing so would require an extremely complex and difficult excavation effort. That early warning turned out to be remarkably prescient, because it set the tone for everything that's happened since. By March of 2026, Iran's own foreign minister addressed the question directly in a television interview, stating plainly that the country's nuclear facilities had been attacked and that everything was now under the rubble. He went further, saying Iran had no program and no plan at that time to actually recover the material from beneath the wreckage. On the surface, that sounds like a fairly reassuring admission, Iran itself claiming the material was buried and inaccessible. But intelligence assessments circulating around the same time told a very different story. According to reporting citing American officials, intelligence agencies had concluded that Iran actually remained capable of reaching its main stockpile at Isfahan, despite the strikes that had sealed the site beneath the ground. Satellite imagery reviewed by multiple outlets showed ongoing excavation activity near the tunnel entrances at Isfahan, continuing well after the June 2025 strikes. Activity that strongly suggested Iran was actively working to recover access to that stockpile regardless of what its own foreign minister was saying publicly. That contradiction, Iran's public claims of inaccessibility running directly against satellite evidence of active excavation, became one of the defining tensions of the entire post-strike period. And it only got more complicated from there, because in February of 2026, the IAEA released a confidential report confirming something even more specific and even more concerning. Based on evidence gathered before access was lost, the agency confirmed that a significant portion of Iran's 60% enriched material had actually been stored inside an underground tunnel complex at Isfahan, a complex that, according to the agency's own satellite monitoring, appeared to have survived the strikes structurally intact. The tunnel entrances themselves showed signs of being deliberately and completely backfilled with soil, sealed off rather than destroyed, and the IAEA noted regular vehicular activity around those sealed entrances continuing into this year. Think about what that combination actually tells you. A tunnel that survived the most powerful bunker-busting campaign in American military history, deliberately resealed rather than left exposed, with continuing signs of activity around it. That's not the picture of a destroyed stockpile. That's the picture of a stockpile being actively protected and potentially managed. The IAEA's own Director General has been remarkably direct about the scale of this problem in his formal reporting to the agency's Board of Governors. As of the most recent assessment, inspectors have not had verified access to confirm Iran's declared uranium inventories for more than 8 consecutive months, an unprecedented gap in nuclear verification for a program this advanced and this closely watched. And this isn't just about the material at Isfahan either, because analysts at multiple research institutions have pointed out that Iran's stockpile could realistically be split across several locations rather than concentrated in one place, potentially buried in rubble at Natanz or Fordow, stored inside the tunnel complex at Isfahan, or moved entirely into a newer facility that's become known publicly as Pickaxe Mountain, a site Israeli intelligence believes may now house both enrichment centrifuges and a portion of the stockpile itself. One research analysis covering this topic deliberately used plural language when describing where this material might be located, several clandestine facilities rather than a single site, which tells you just how uncertain even the most sophisticated outside analysis remains about the true picture. Now here's where the numbers get even more concerning, because producing that 60% stockpile in the first place required an enormous, sustained technical effort. According to a detailed calculation published by arms control researchers earlier this year, generating Iran's full stockpile of 60% enriched uranium required more than 55,000 separative work units, the standard technical measure of enrichment effort. That's not a number that gets rebuilt overnight if the material genuinely was destroyed, but it's also exactly why losing track of whether that material actually survived intact represents such a serious problem, because if it did survive, Iran doesn't need to redo that entire 55,000 unit effort from scratch. It just needs to take material that's already 90% of the way to weapons grade and push it the rest of the way. A comparatively small and fast final step, according to the same experts who've spent years tracking this exact stockpile. So this is the situation that's been quietly building for more than a year, a country that claims its most dangerous nuclear material is buried and inaccessible, satellite evidence suggesting otherwise, international inspectors locked out for the better part of a year, and a stockpile large enough, according to the IAEA's own Director General, to theoretically produce somewhere close to 10 separate nuclear weapons if it were ever fully processed to weapons grade. That's the backdrop against which the conversation in Washington has now genuinely started to shift, and this is where the game actually starts changing. For most of the past year, American strategy toward this material has been almost entirely about destruction from a distance, more strikes, bigger bombs, deeper bunker-busting weapons aimed at facilities like Pickaxe Mountain specifically because officials believe it might now house part of the hidden stockpile. But destruction from a distance runs directly into the exact verification problem we just walked through. You can drop the most powerful conventional weapon in the American arsenal on a target and still have no reliable way of confirming whether the uranium underneath actually got destroyed or simply got reburied deeper. That frustration appears to have pushed the conversation toward a fundamentally different approach, one that doesn't rely on destroying the material remotely at all, but instead on physically locating it, securing it, and removing it directly. Reports have emerged indicating the president is genuinely open to the idea of launching a targeted military operation specifically to seize Iran's uranium stockpile rather than simply continuing to bomb suspected storage sites and hope for the best. According to that reporting, the administration has been actively weighing the risk to American troops involved in exactly this kind of operation, with estimates suggesting a mission of this scale could require deploying somewhere close to 1,000 specially trained forces into Iranian territory. That is an enormous, high-stakes commitment, and it reflects just how seriously this specific piece of the broader nuclear question is now being treated, not as a bombing target anymore, but as a physical object that needs to be located, secured, and extracted under combat conditions. Experts who study this exact scenario have been blunt about just how dangerous and complicated that kind of operation would actually be. Any mission to physically secure this material would involve real radiation exposure risks, real chemical handling hazards, given the specialized forms uranium takes once it's been enriched to this level, and the challenge of excavating through tunnels and rubble that may still be structurally unstable after previous strikes, all while operating under the constant threat of Iranian counterattack in hostile territory. One nuclear security specialist described the entire concept as an extraordinarily complex, risky, and lengthy undertaking, and that assessment lines up with basically every serious analysis of what a ground operation like this would actually require. This isn't a straightforward smash and grab. It's closer to a full combat engineering operation being conducted under fire, with nuclear contamination risk layered on top of the standard dangers of operating deep inside enemy territory. And that difficulty is exactly why, for a long time, officials publicly downplayed the urgency of actually going after this material directly. Earlier this year, when asked whether recovering the stockpile was an immediate priority, the president himself gave a notably measured answer, saying the administration wasn't currently focused on it, but that at some point it might become one. That kind of hedge, we're not doing this right now, but we might later, has been a consistent pattern throughout this entire nuclear standoff. And it reflects the genuine tension at the heart of this decision, weighing the very real danger of leaving that much near-weapons-grade material sitting unaccounted for against the very real danger of sending a large ground force into hostile Iranian territory specifically to go get it. There's another detail from earlier this year that's worth sitting with too, because it tells you something important about how seriously other major powers are also taking this exact question. Reports indicated that Russian President Vladimir Putin had offered to have Russia take control of Iran's enriched uranium stockpile as part of some kind of negotiated arrangement, an offer the American president reportedly rebuffed entirely. Think about the strategic logic behind an offer like that for a second, because on its face, having a third party take custody of dangerous nuclear material sounds like exactly the kind of de-escalation move that should reduce risk for everyone involved. But rejecting that offer tells you the administration clearly didn't trust that arrangement to actually solve the underlying problem, whether because of skepticism about Russia's own reliability and motives, or because of concern that Iran would simply refuse to actually hand the material over in the first place, given how much leverage it currently represents. Either way, that rejected offer is one more data point showing just how unresolved and how contested this specific piece of the broader Iran conflict actually remains, even among countries that aren't directly at war with each other. It's worth stepping back to understand just how unusual this level of sustained uncertainty actually is in the broader history of nuclear non-proliferation efforts, because the IAEA doesn't typically lose track of a declared stockpile of this size for this long, even in countries with genuinely adversarial relationships with international inspectors. The agency's Director General has spent years building a public record of increasingly blunt warnings about Iran's program, and even before this latest gap in verification, he had already stated that a stockpile of this size, if fully weaponized, could theoretically produce somewhere close to 10 separate nuclear devices, while being careful to note that possessing that quantity of material doesn't automatically mean a country has actually built a functioning weapon. That distinction matters, and it's one worth holding on to throughout this entire story. Having the raw material is a necessary step toward a weapon, but it isn't the same thing as actually having one. Still, the gap between those two things has always been described by nuclear security experts as smaller and faster to close than most people assume, and that's exactly why an extended period with zero verified inspector access represents such a serious problem, regardless of whether Iran has actually taken that final step or not. There's also a longer historical pattern worth placing this moment inside, because Iran's relationship with international nuclear inspectors has never been straightforward, even decades before this current war began. Inspectors have previously found traces of enriched uranium turning up unexpectedly at sites Iran had officially declared as purely civilian in nature, sometimes at levels well beyond what those facilities were supposed to be capable of producing. Iran's typical response to these kinds of discoveries has followed a fairly consistent playbook over the years, offering an alternative explanation, disputing the sampling methodology, or blaming contaminated equipment purchased from other countries, while continuing to insist its overall program has always been peaceful in nature. Western governments have just as consistently pushed back against those explanations, describing them as part of a long-standing pattern of evasion rather than a genuine, transparent accounting of the program's history. This current standoff over the 60% stockpile fits neatly into that same decades-long pattern. Another chapter in a much longer story where the technical facts on the ground and Iran's public statements about those facts have rarely lined up cleanly, and where outside verification has consistently proven far harder to achieve than anyone negotiating with Iran has ever hoped. Let's talk about the detection and verification technology itself for a moment, because this is genuinely one of the more fascinating and underappreciated parts of this entire story. When people imagine how a country like the United States tracks nuclear material, There's often an assumption that satellites or some kind of advanced remote sensing system can just detect uranium directly from orbit or from high altitude. That's simply not how this technology actually works. Uranium doesn't show up on a normal camera image, and detecting its radioactive signature requires specialized sensors that generally need to operate within a very short range of the actual material, often within a matter of feet rather than miles, which makes remote detection from safe distances extraordinarily difficult against a material that's been deliberately shielded and buried underground. The tools that do exist for this kind of verification are genuinely specialized. The United States Air Force operates a fleet of aircraft specifically designed to detect radioactive particles released into the atmosphere following a nuclear event, sampling the air itself for telltale isotopes that would indicate whether an explosion actually involved nuclear material. But that only works if the wind carries detectable particles far enough for those aircraft to actually collect a usable sample, and it only tells you that some release happened, not necessarily how much material was involved or whether the bulk of a stockpile survived intact somewhere nearby. Beyond that, there are specialized drones and low-flying aircraft equipped with gamma-ray and neutron detectors capable of mapping radioactive sources from the air, but those platforms have to fly extremely close to the ground to be effective, which makes them genuinely vulnerable to being shot down in contested airspace, exactly the kind of airspace Iran has spent this entire war trying to maintain some level of control over. Even newer approaches combining satellite imagery with artificial intelligence and machine learning, technology that can detect subtle structural changes or unusual vehicle activity around a suspected site, still can't actually confirm the presence or destruction of the uranium itself. They can only flag patterns worth investigating further through other means. Put simply, there's no clean, safe, remote way to verify this specific question with confidence, which is exactly why the conversation has increasingly shifted toward physically sending people in to check, however dangerous that option genuinely is. This is really the heart of why this story represents such a fundamental shift in how this entire conflict is being approached. For the better part of a year, the operating assumption was that airstrikes alone could solve the nuclear proliferation problem. Hit the facilities hard enough, and the material inside becomes irrelevant because it's been vaporized along with everything else. That assumption made intuitive sense in the immediate aftermath of the original 2025 strikes, when officials confidently described the operation as a clear success. But over the following months, as satellite imagery kept showing tunnel entrances being resealed rather than left as rubble, as vehicular activity kept appearing around supposedly destroyed sites, and as Iran's own officials gave answers that didn't fully align with what independent analysts were observing, that original confident assumption started eroding piece by piece. The game changed the moment American and allied intelligence agencies effectively concluded that bombing alone couldn't guarantee this specific problem was actually solved, and that the only way to know for certain would be to go in on the ground and physically confirm what happened to that material, whether that means finding it destroyed, finding it intact and securing it, or finding nothing at all and having to reassess the entire picture from scratch. It's worth pausing here to think about what each of those three outcomes would actually mean for the broader war, because they lead to genuinely different futures. If a ground operation eventually confirmed the material had actually been destroyed in the original strikes after all, that would represent a genuine, verifiable resolution to one of the most dangerous open questions of this entire conflict, and it would meaningfully undercut Iran's remaining leverage in any future negotiation, because the primary asset they've been implicitly threatening to weaponize would be confirmed gone. If instead a ground operation found the material intact and successfully secured it, that would represent an enormous decisive blow to Iran's nuclear ambitions, physically removing the most dangerous component of their program from their control entirely, though at a very real cost in terms of the risk absorbed by the forces conducting that operation. And if a ground operation went in and found nothing at all, no material where intelligence believed it should be, that would represent possibly the most alarming outcome of the three, because it would mean the stockpile had already been successfully moved somewhere else entirely, restarting this entire uncertainty from square one with even less confidence about where roughly 10 weapons worth of near-weapons grade material might actually be sitting. That last scenario is honestly the one that keeps a lot of non-proliferation experts up at night, because Iran has had well over a year now to move, disperse, or further conceal this material across multiple sites since the original strikes happened. Every month that passes without verified inspector access is another month where the confidence level around any specific location estimate degrades further. And it's worth remembering that this isn't a new phenomenon for Iran's nuclear program either, because the country has a long documented history of resolving one nuclear transparency crisis only to have a new one emerge somewhere else. Traces of enriched uranium turning up unexpectedly at sites Iran claimed were purely civilian. IAEA inspectors flagging locations where samples didn't match what had been officially declared, warehouses in Tehran showing radioactive particle traces without Iran fully cooperating to explain their origin. This current uncertainty around the 60% stockpile fits into a much longer pattern of a nuclear program that has consistently proven more difficult to fully verify than any single round of inspections or any single military strike has managed to resolve. So, where does this actually leave things right now, in the final days of July 2026? The uncertainty hasn't gone away, and if anything, it's gotten more consequential as this broader war has escalated through multiple additional rounds of fighting since those original strikes happened. Pickaxe Mountain remains a live and repeatedly threatened target, with officials continuing to discuss potential strikes against it specifically because of concerns it may now house both new centrifuges and part of the relocated stockpile. The Isfahan tunnel complex remains sealed, unverified, and showing continued signs of activity more than a year after it was supposedly rendered irrelevant by American and Israeli bombs. And now, layered on top of all of that, is a genuine, serious internal debate happening at the highest levels of the American government about whether the only real way to resolve this specific piece of the puzzle is to stop relying on airstrikes entirely and instead send a significant ground force directly into Iranian territory to find out, once and for all, exactly what happened to that material. That's an enormous shift in strategy, and it's one that carries genuinely enormous risk in both directions. Send forces in, and something goes wrong. And you're looking at American casualties in a mission specifically designed around one of the most dangerous materials on the planet, conducted deep inside hostile territory that's already proven capable of shooting down American aircraft earlier this year. Don't send forces in, and you're accepting an indefinite, open-ended uncertainty about whether a country that's spent the entire war demonstrating both the will and the capability to keep fighting still has access to material that sits just one relatively small technical step away from an actual functioning nuclear weapon. Neither option is comfortable, and that discomfort is exactly why this question has remained unresolved for so long, even as nearly every other front of this war has continued escalating around it. There's also a broader international dimension to this question that goes beyond just the direct standoff between Washington and Tehran, because the entire world has a stake in how this specific piece of the story eventually resolves. Every country that relies on the Strait of Hormuz for energy imports, every government that's watched oil prices swing wildly throughout this war, every ally weighing how much further support to commit to this ongoing conflict, all of them are implicitly waiting on some kind of resolution to the uranium question, because it sits underneath nearly every other decision being made about this war right now. If the material is confirmed destroyed, that removes one of the most serious justifications for continued military pressure and opens real space for a broader diplomatic settlement. If the material is confirmed intact and gets successfully secured, that removes Iran's most dangerous remaining card while still leaving every other dimension of this conflict. The missile programs, the naval harassment campaigns, the proxy networks, very much unresolved. And if the material simply can't be found at all, that arguably makes every other part of this war more dangerous rather than less, because it means the single most catastrophic potential outcome of this entire conflict, an actual functioning nuclear weapon in Iranian hands, remains a live and completely unverified possibility, no matter how many other battles get fought and won along the way. That's precisely why this specific thread deserves so much more attention than it typically gets buried under headlines about airstrikes, tanker attacks, and diplomatic pauses. Every one of those other stories, as significant as they genuinely are, ultimately exists downstream of this one core unresolved question. You can win every naval engagement in the Strait of Hormuz, dismantle every coastal missile bunker along Iran's southern coastline, and still not have actually solved the single most dangerous problem this entire war was originally supposed to address back in February of 2026. That's the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath more than a year of intense fighting, strikes, and diplomatic maneuvering, and it's exactly why the quiet shift toward considering a direct ground operation represents such a significant moment in how this conflict is actually being approached going forward. What we can say with real confidence is this: Iran built its entire strategy around this stockpile on the assumptions that depth and secrecy would be enough protection. The same basic assumption that shaped its coastal missile bunkers, the same assumption behind Pickaxe Mountain's construction, the same assumption underlying nearly every hardened facility this country has built for years. Bombs alone haven't been enough to fully resolve that bet, because bombs can destroy a building without ever confirming what actually happened to the material inside it. And that specific gap, the space between believing a strike worked and actually verifying that it did, is precisely the gap the United States now appears to be seriously considering closing the hard way, by walking in and checking for themselves. There's also a time pressure element to this entire debate that doesn't get discussed nearly enough, because every month that passes without a resolution doesn't just leave the uncertainty unchanged, it actively makes the underlying problem harder to solve. Tunnels that were structurally weakened by last year's strikes continue settling and shifting over time, which means any eventual excavation effort, whether conducted by American forces or by Iran's own engineers, becomes progressively more dangerous and more technically demanding the longer it gets delayed. Radioactive material that's been sitting in damaged, potentially compromised storage conditions for well over a year raises its own separate set of contamination and handling concerns compared to material that was properly stored and secured before any strikes ever happened. And from a pure intelligence standpoint, every additional month gives Iran more time to potentially move, disperse, or further conceal the stockpile across additional locations, degrading the confidence level of every existing satellite assessment and every piece of intelligence gathered before access was lost. That combination of factors, structural degradation, radiological risk, and intelligence decay, is exactly why this specific question can't simply be left indefinitely unresolved the way some other lower stakes disputes in this war have been allowed to drag on. At some point, whether through diplomacy, through a ground operation, or through some combination of both, this uncertainty has to get resolved one way or another, because the alternative is accepting an open-ended worsening risk that sits quietly underneath every other headline this conflict continues to produce. If this breakdown helped you understand why this specific stockpile matters so much more than another round of headline strikes, go ahead and drop a like, because this is genuinely one of the most underexplained and consistently overlooked threads running through this entire war, even though it may end up mattering more than almost anything else happening on the battlefield right now. Let me know in the comments whether you think a ground operation to secure this material is actually worth the risk given everything we've walked through, or whether you think the smarter play is continuing to rely on strikes, sanctions, and diplomatic pressure instead of putting American forces directly on the ground inside Iranian territory. Subscribe if you want to keep following this story closely and in real detail, because between the ongoing uncertainty at Isfahan, the continued threats against Pickaxe Mountain, and now this real, serious internal debate over a physical seizure operation, this is a thread that could produce one of the single most significant developments of the entire war with very little advance warning to anyone watching from the outside. And share this with anyone who's been following the strikes and the ceasefires closely without realizing that the actual most dangerous open question in this entire conflict has never really been about the bombing campaigns at all. It's been about 440 kilograms of material that nobody outside of Iran has been able to verify the exact location of for well over a year now, sitting quietly beneath the surface of nearly every other headline this war has produced. Thanks for watching, and we'll be right here the moment there's a real verified answer to this question.